Welcome to Mastering ASP.NET MVC 2.0 on TechPub with myself, Rob Connery, and Steven Sanderson. In this series, we're going to try and cover introductory topics to super advanced. We're going to try and divide up each section, each episode, into the most basic thing and then build on top of that until we get into the nitty-gritty of ASP.NET MVC 2.0. What we expect from you, in terms of who this series is for, we kind of expect you to be someone who is at least familiar with what MVC is. I'm sure you've seen Scott Hanselman's File New. Maybe you've seen some of the presentations I've done on ASP.NET/MVC. So we're expecting that you're a little bit familiar with what MVC is, or at least have heard of it. We're assuming that you are familiar with the web, that you understand HTML to a degree, that you understand CSS, JavaScript, and we also expect that you know how to work with a database, that you know how to put together a query, that maybe you know how to put together some tables in a relational way, that you understand how to do all that. We are aiming this entire screencast towards people who are coming in from ASP.NET web forms. Also developers who might be coming in from other platforms like PHP, perhaps Rails, and also for MVC developers who just want to cover their basics and want to get to know the platform better. Specifically people who might want to know what's new in 2.0.
So let's do the ubiquitous File New demo for folks who have never seen ASP.NET MVC. And this is your typical new project dialog that is part of Visual Studio 2008. And there you get to choose from all kinds of projects. And I've just chosen Visual Studio's ASP.NET MVC 2. First thing it does is worth noting. It asks you, do you want to create a testing project? In ASP.NET, we have separate projects for doing separate things. We don't put our tests in the same project that we're working on. Instead, we have separate ones. And here we have two projects. One of them is the MVC application. Here's the directories that you get. Note that it comes with everything you need to get running. It is pre-built with views and scripts, as well as account and membership setup for you. We're going to be talking a lot more about controllers and views in future episodes. One thing I do want to show you, however, is this test application. This is actually Microsoft Visual Studio's test framework. A lot of people can't really use that because they're not using the free version, the paid version of Visual Studio. Instead, if you want to get around that and use a different library, you should remove this. And you can use a class library project. This is, again, a free thing inside of Visual Studio. And once you get it set up, you're going to want to do two things. Delete that annoying class1.cs. And then you're going to do something called add references. And what that means is you simply want to tie in the compilation, the build of your other project so you can write tests against it. In this case, we are going to make sure we have a reference, and we do, and we're ready to test. So when you do finally get started with ASP.NET MVC, this is what you're going to have to work with. Now we're going to expand a lot on how to use this tool set, but this is the bare bones. This is what it looks like when you hit File New. So let's take a bit of a deeper look at this application that we've just created. And the first thing to notice is if you're familiar with web forms, well, you're going to see a lot of things that are going to be familiar. As we keep saying, MVC is built on top of ASP.NET, and you get a global.asx, which is what I'm showing here, with some basic MVC wiring that we're going to go into later. You also get to work with master pages, and these things are indeed web forms. So at the core of your layout hierarchy is actually a web form with runat equals server, believe it or not. So you're not completely abandoning the whole web form thing. Just works in a slightly different way. The next thing to notice here is that you have the same folder structure abilities. If you want to add a database, for instance, to your app data folder, well, that works in the same exact way as well. Here I'm just adding a simple blog database for some later demos. In fact, if you wanted to get nuts and crazy, you could also add in an ASP-specific folder, such as app code. And guess what? You won't ever believe it, but it actually works with MVC because the code you put in there is dynamically compiled, which is an interesting thing. If you take a trip through the web.config, if you're an ASP.NET developer, this will look familiar to you. In fact, there's nothing really that's terribly different in here than any other ASP.NET application. except when we come down to the modules. Inside of here, you're going to see a couple different handlers and modules, and these are the things that handle MVC kind of at the core, if you will. These are the things that get the handoff from routing. And speaking of routing, there is the URL routing module that is going to be common between both web forms and ASP.NET MVC. So if you're an ASP.NET developer coming into MVC for the first time, you should take a bit of comfort here. It's not all that different.
Is web forms dead? That's a question I get all the time. Well, it's not quite dead, but I could tell you it's sort of obsolete. Consider what web forms replaced. It replaced scripted pages. It turned a website into software, into an application. There's an abstraction there, and when it was invented or created many, many years ago, it followed a forms-based approach, a visual forms development approach that was in vogue at the time with Visual Basic, VB6. Well, nowadays, the web has matured, it has changed. You have things like Rails and Django that use the MVC pattern. It has sort of thrown development on its ear. By that I mean it's introduced a streamlined way of building an application based on opinion. So in other words, we've done these things a zillion times. Why don't we leverage what we already know? ASP.NET MVC is sort of the same thing. You're going to hear it a lot throughout this screencast. The whole idea of convention over configuration. And the idea that, man, we've done this, we've configured these things, we've set these sites up. We know we need logging. We know that we have a data access that we need to do. We know that we tend to scaffold, if you will, these sites and need tables and input stuff. So let's just build it in. MVC is nothing new. Microsoft did not invent MVC. They will be the first to jump up and down and make sure that you understand that. MVC is probably the oldest application architectural pattern.
The model view controller pattern was first formulated back in the early 70s by Dr. Trygve Reinskog. He was a professor at the Central Institute for Industrial Research in Oslo, Norway. At the time, he was staring at ships in a shipyard, looking at their comings and goings, trying to figure out a way that he could take that model, that behavioral aspect of ships in a shipyard, cruising back and forth, and translate that into a digital model. And he, at the time, came up with a thing that he called Thing Model View Editor. Well, fast forward a few years into 1978, Dr. Reinskog was out in Palo Alto, California, and he was visiting at Xerox, at the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, Xerox Park. And at the time, he was working on a language called Smalltalk 80 to be precise. Now before this, everything in computer science was what they call procedural, sort of inline scripting, if you will, to put it ever so gently. But come around the late 70s, Smalltalk was introduced and was one of the first object-oriented languages out there. And that leap gave Dr. Reinskog what he needed to finalize a paper on the whole idea of model view controller. Since then, the whole idea of MVC has kind of taken hold. It is a very, very simple pattern, and it fits just about any application. And then fast forward to 2004, and David Heinemeier Hansson formulated the platform called Rails. He was looking for a way to use the Ruby scripting language to create a web framework with for an application that he had to create. He fell in love with Ruby, and then he quickly wrapped a framework around it based on the model view controller pattern. It's pretty much how most computer science folks know it today. They were introduced to it with Rails. Now, of course, it predates that. There was a lot of frameworks that used it, Spring and Struts and a bunch of stuff in Java. Ruby on Rails was not at all the first, as we mentioned here. It's a very old platform.
Let's talk about some business reasons why you might want to transition your dev shop, your team, your application you've been running, whatever, over to ASP.NET MVC, and let's say the obvious straight up front. If you're running a successful business and everything's going well, you're rocking and you're stable, there is no need. If you're .NET Nuke, for instance, and everything is working just fine, there really is no need. There's nothing that MVC is going to buy you in the short term that you can look at and say, aha, wow, look how much money or time I saved by using MVC. It's not the case. However, if you stretch that view out a little bit longer and you look to the medium to long term, let's just say over the next 2 to 3 years, and you consider the growth of your application, the changes that you might put in, and how many changes you want to put in, if you have a lot of those, and you want to try and have something that has less friction, as I keep saying, that also supports you or allows your developers to build in guarantees, if you will, using unit testing, and you want to build in some flexibility so that future changes won't be so difficult, then MVC might be something for you to consider. If you're coming in from another application or you're upgrading, let's say from ASP.NET 1.1, or you're using a PHP and you're thinking about moving to Microsoft, yes, by all means, go straight to MVC. And the reason I say that so readily and so quickly is that MVC, as I keep saying this, is much more flexible. It's much more extensible. We're going to get to all of this in later episodes, but what that resolves down to for your developers is fun. The more that they can address your problem, the more that they make you happy, for lack of better words, the more that they can test and make sure that there's no bugs that you're going to call them for at midnight, well, that makes happier developers and makes you a happier camper as well. It's all good stuff. Now, if you're thinking, wait a minute, now this unit testing thing, this didn't just come about with MVC, and that's true. With MVC, it's just easier. And when something's easier and there's less friction, developers will more readily do it, and they'll probably do it to a finer degree of detail. One other thing to consider is, as a manager, as a person with business interests, if you have junior developers that are coming in, it is much easier for them to adopt a framework or adopt a set of practices if they are opinionated or if there's convention behind it. It means they don't have to think so much about it. This is just where you put your controllers. This is how you do this. This is what you're supposed to do with this framework. Work within these confines. That's just a great thing for a business owner who needs to hire in new help, and especially a dev lead who needs to hire in somebody. They can just turn them on to some videos like this one at TechPub and say, get to know this thing because you're going to be working in it. And the good thing for you, if you're a junior developer watching this, is that it's easy. It's super easy to pick up. There's some concepts that take you to about 80%, and then after that you can find out all about the cool patterns and so on. So that's great. The other thing that is awesome for a business lead is the inverse of what I just said, and that is that your more senior developers, the guys that really know what they're doing, it sort of corrals them a bit. If you give a senior developer an IDE and a compiler and you say, make me an app, yeah, you're going to end up with, well, you're going to end up with something that works really well. But you never know if it's going to be a rocket, a satellite, or what. A lot of times, well, developers like to tinker. I'm one of those developers. I love to tinker. I love to try new things. I just might have read an article and I want to try a new pattern out on you. Look out. So MVC with its conventions, ASP.NET MVC with its conventions tends to corral these guys. So that's something else to consider.
Let's take a look at what basic workflow with ASP.NET MVC might look like. In this example, I'm going to scaffold a posts table that I've created for this demo in the ubiquitous blog database. So here you can see I have a post table inside of a SQL Server database called blog, and I am going to use link to SQL as my data access. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create a controller. Controllers are at the heart of ASP.NET MVC, and I'm going to call it post controller after the name of my table. And then I'm going to add action methods, create, update, and delete, the CRUD scenarios, if you will. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow me to scaffold some structure, some views and actions in a controller around my posts table. So I add that controller in, and as you can see, basic methods RESTful methods, which we'll talk about more later, are created for me. These are called actions on a controller. Each one of these things does a certain operation, responds to a certain type of HTTP verb. And the first one I'm going to work with is the default action called index. And what this is going to do is it's going to return all of the records, post records, back to the view. Now I simply, to have this happen, just need to ask link to SQL for a set of records, and then I could just pass those records off into the return method, and ASP.NET MVC does the rest. Now to get the view to show up, I just use the tooling and I right click as you see here, and it knows that we need an index view because we're in the index action. And I'm going to work with a strongly typed view, just pass in my post class, and that'll be sure to let it know that I want this index action, this index view to have list content. What's going to happen here is the framework is going to create HTML for me that will show a list of posts. Now the framework is smart enough to figure out the basic columns that are on the post table, including the primary key, so I can set up HTML links off to the other pages I might need, including edit and create and so on. So here you can see the records that are in my database, and I'm going to hit F5, run. I'm going to modify the web config, and when I start up the page, I simply enter the name of the controller into the URL. This is part of conventional routing, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So this goes to the default action of the post controller, and you can see this is the HTML that was generated for us. It's exciting. We're on our way. So the next thing I want to do here is I want to check out details. So I want to see this individual record, and we don't have this view. We haven't created it yet. The only view we have is the index. So now what I want to do is I'll go down to the details action, and I can just copy and paste the data operation that I'm doing here. And for those of you wondering why I'm working with link to SQL directly in the controller, well, this is not the best idea, but we'll talk more about that later. Okay, well now what I want to do is just grab the single record, and I'm going to use a bit of convention here because MVC will actually pass this ID through to me into the URL, right into the action. Routing is smart enough to parse this whole thing for me and pass it in as an argument onto the action. Talk more about that later when we talk about routing. So now what I need to do is again add a view for details, and I'll do the same thing and make sure it's a strongly typed class and make sure the content is details, and I'll hit add, and here we go. Once again I have the HTML created for me and the view created for me in the right folder. Everything is going really well. So now let's go back and take a look. If I hit run or F5, see the page come up over here. Once again, I'll type in the name of the controller, post, and if I click details this time, I get to see the value. There it is, and you can see in the URL up there that 1 was passed in. 1 is the ID, and that was parsed out by routing, and it was passed in as an argument. I didn't have to do any request.form, request.queryString. MVC handles it for us by convention. All right, well, let's do the same thing. We'll set up our edit action and our edit view. Same thing, I'll pull out a single record and I'll just pass it down to the view in the return. And once again, when I create content, this time I'm going to set up for edit. And this is going to create a form for me, all the HTML I need for an edit form. And you can see it's created here in the post directory underneath my views folder. Once again, a conventional approach to the structure of your application. So I hit F5 and run. Now I can go see what my edit page looks like, and here is all my information for me created by the tooling. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this title, and I hit save. Well, what do you think is going to happen? In this case, absolutely nothing. I haven't set up the post back, if you will. I haven't set up the action to handle the post. Now you might think this would be incredibly difficult to do. How do I know when something's been posted? Well, we have two edit actions here. One handles what's called get, using the HTTP verb get. The other handles a post, when someone posts a form in, and we denote this by using the accept verbs attribute. This delineates the two, and it basically acts like an overload. So for this routine, I'm simply going to pull the post back out of the database using the ID that's passed in. I'm going to use the built-in update model. This is going to synchronize the passed-in form collection, which is a decoration of request.form. I'll send that thing to a value provider, and then I'll bind it to my post. This does all the left-right coding, so to speak, and then I just say submit changes. This is all of 4 lines of code inside of a try-catch block, and if we have an error, which I'll talk about in a second, I'll pass that post back in. All right, let's go to the edit page, and what I'm going to do in here is once again tweak the way this thing looks, and then I'll save it down, and we should see a changed title. Yep, there it is. Great. All right, well, you can see how this process is starting to flow. What I'm actually doing is I'm building out my controller, not really caring about my UI. I'll care about my UI in just a minute when I work out additional work on top of my scaffolding process. So let's work with create this time. I want to create a new post. And once again, you see we have 2 create methods. One handles the get, the other one handles a post. So what I want to do first is create the form. The get always returns the UI, so I'm going to do the same thing. It's a typed page. I'm going to work with the create content. This is going to create a form for me, and here it is. Once again, so I'm going to hit run, and we have one thing that we have to change here on this page. When it comes up, you'll notice we have a spot for the post ID. We don't want that. So the reason I'm showing you this is to show you that you can change this UI to your needs and you won't break anything. Just because we don't pass a record in, model binding, the thing that handles setting up the model in the background, is highly flexible. So if something's not there, it does its best to bind and save down your records. Okay, well, I'm going to add in a new record here, and I'll hit create, and once again, nothing happens. And the reason why is that we didn't set up our post handler. So once again, we got to come in here to our second create method, which handles the post, as you can see by the attribute accept verbs. We have a try catch again, except this time I'm going to do something funky. I'm going to rely on model binding. All I've got to do is tell this action I expect a post to be passed in to me from somewhere. In this case, it's going to be from request.form. It can be passed in through the query string, from cookies, from session, temp data. In this case, I don't really care where it comes from. I'm just expecting a post, and model binding is going to do its best to help me out with that. And you can see I've added some link to SQL code to pass that back into the database, all of 2 lines. And once again, I'm going to go back to my create form, and I am going to add in some silliness here. And there we are. We have a record, brand new record. Now that was pretty easy stuff. And what we've done is fully scaffolded this post table. But what happens when we have an error? We haven't really covered that very much. Notice that I simply returned the record back down to the view if we have an error. Well, let's take a look at what that error might look like. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a numeric column. In this case, I'll just call it comment count, set it to be an integer. And then I've adjusted my link to SQL class to reflect that. And so now what I can do is I can simply go back to my view page, change the comment count, or excuse me, add in a comment count form element, as you can see. And I'll hit run, and what I'm going to do is make sure that this thing works the way we expect it to. I'll enter 50 and make sure that I've come back into edit, that it shows up. And there it is. Good. So now we have comments going back and forth. What if I enter a string like 50? And this time we are going to get a problem. Now, notice that I didn't have to write any of these statements out. This was handled by convention using the validation bits. The validators knew that something was wrong. We caught an error. We returned the object back down to the form. Model binders were alerted that there was an exception, and the exception was handed off to the model binders from the framework. All this stuff was handled for us. This is the whole idea about reducing friction with ASP.NET MVC.
So let's get to the most difficult aspect of this whole section, which is for you as a technical person. What are the technical reasons that you might want to transition to ASP.NET MVC? And this is pretty tough because the transition itself really revolves around you. The decision to move revolves around you and what you think is important. I'll just throw that straight out. As I've been mentioning, MVC strives to remove friction from everyday development, but it also allows you to embrace what are generally considered to be very good development practices. You keep hearing me discuss unit testing. Well, ASP.NET MVC allows you to do it to a finer detail, allows you to do it more, and a lot of people react very strangely to that. People think that when you talk about unit testing, you're talking about a certain way of doing unit testing, such as test-driven development. They don't really want to hear it. The discussions have been very animated, very opinionated, people casting all kinds of really negative aspersions around the discussion forums. That's not really something I'm considering at all in this discussion. I'm just talking about unit testing. You do it whenever you want. MVC allows you to do it better. As a developer, this is something that you need to do. You need to test your stuff. This isn't something that I think. It's not something that Microsoft has come out and said. It's not something that alt.net or whatever group you belong to thinks is good. This is a thing that you do as a developer in computer sciences. And you should do. And I will come out further and say that working with a Microsoft toolset, with the visual tooling style, drag and drop and everything, has allowed developers to get away from that. There hasn't been an emphasis in this, primarily because there hasn't been a market for it. Microsoft generally skews its development tools towards developers inside of, let's say, a corporate environment, people that might have been coming in from other disciplines that may not be straight up computer science guys and ladies. They just might be, I don't know, business unit folks that need to take something that looked like a spreadsheet on their spreadsheet and make it look like a spreadsheet on the web. So unit testing doesn't quite fit that scenario. Unfortunately, a lot of folks have come into web development in that way. You might be one of those folks, maybe you're not. If you don't test your stuff, if you're not a big unit tester, consider this a chance to change. Consider this actually in a positive light, that if you found it difficult to do before, MVC is going to help you write tests, because it's going to make it easier.
You've probably heard a number of times that ASP.NET MVC is great with unit testing, so let's take a look at why that is. So if I click on my details action, you can see I can find an individual post record. What if I come up here and I change the ID to something like 11? It doesn't exist in the database. We get an object reference error, null reference, if you will. And we can fix that by coming down to our details action. And you take a look at the URL, you can see post controller details action. So we can come in here and we can say, well, let's be good coders, and instead of sending an object down and not knowing if it's null, well, let's check and see if it's null. If it is, I'm going to return a specific view, not the default view. The default view is named after the action itself, but you can specify a different one if you like, which we are here. We're going to call one 404. Using the tooling, we right-click and add that view in. Now, this is currently in the post directory. Probably a better choice would be to have it be in a shared directory, so all the controllers, we can just output a nice 404 message. However, if you want to be specific and you want to say you can't find the page or post, for instance, you can just put it in the target directory. Okay, so we've put a nice message down here, and now if we go back over here and refresh the page, we should see our new page, and there we do. Great, and notice the URL is the same. We've just returned a different view. All right, well, there's a better way to do this. We have visual confirmation that everything works, but it would be nice if we could automate and make sure that everything works the way it's supposed to. For this, we're going to use a unit test, and here is my test project. I have a class in here called postControllerTests, and I am going to create a method in here that is going to be a test using XUnit, the XUnit framework. So what I simply want to test is that the details view is going to return the default view for a valid post. So I just need to instantiate my controller, and in here I'm going to set a result to the result that is returned from the details action. I'm going to cast this as a view result, because right now that is the only thing that can come back from the details action. And I need to pass in an argument. That argument is going to be the post ID. So I'll pass in a 1. And then what I want to do is I want to make sure that I'm going to test the view name that is returned. Now this is going to look a little strange to you, but what we really want to test here is that the view name is empty. And if it's empty, that essentially means we are working with the default view. You might think that the view would come back as details or the view name, but it does not, since we are not specifying it. You can see right here we're just passing in the model. We're not specifying the actual view, so the view name is currently set to empty. So when we run our test using testdriven.net as our test runner, you can see that it passes. That's good. Well, now we want to pass and make sure that the 404 is returned if an invalid number is passed in. So you can see, should return 404 view for an invalid post. And to make sure that the number is invalid, I'm going to set this -1 because I know that number can't be in my database. So make sure that we set the view name here to 404 because this is a named view. And I'll run this, and you can see that this test passes. Great. So now we've confirmed this in an automated way. Testing in this way is great because it's automated way of making sure that your application behaves the way you expect it to behave. But I need to offer a little bit of a warning at this point that the tests I wrote here are fine and valid. However, executing them against a database is not really a good idea. The reason for that is simply if you involve external systems, something like a database, that can introduce their own errors, like a wrong connection string, or perhaps connections are used up, whatever, they can cause the test to fail. And the logic in the test won't cause the failure, connection will. And you don't want to have that kind of thing in your tests. We are going to go over this in detail in later episodes. However, what I really wanted to point out here was an easy way to automate the behavior checks on your application so that when you move forward and change things, you have the ability to go back and run all of your tests to make sure that your application hasn't broken.
One other thing ASP.NET MVC is going to allow you to do is work closer with the technologies that basically make the web run. And I've said this previously a little bit, but HTML, JavaScript, CSS, all of those things you need to know very, very well as a developer. The ability to tinker a web page to get the CSS to look just right for your client is very, very important. And I'll give you an example of this. I worked for a client back in 2005 and I was building an intranet application for them, and they wanted it to look very Office-y. And so what we did is we went to one of the component vendors because I didn't know HTML at all or CSS at all well enough to make it look like an Office application. So I went out and found somebody else who did know how to do that, and it was one of the big component vendors, and I said, hey, look, we can buy this suite of components for $800 and just stick it on our web app. So we did. We got some really cool slider controls, a great menu control, we got an awesome grid control, stuck that in everywhere, and we built out our application. Well, wouldn't you know, give it about a month and a half, everything is going pretty well, except users in one remote office said, you know what, this thing is really slow. And not only is it really slow, we'd also like to have some column information over here with some calculated values. And so my boss just sent me an email saying, can you do this? I said, oh boy. Alrighty. Well, let's see. I need to do roll-ups and I need to do a few other things to this grid. Yikes. So problem one. I had to go in, I had to harness the event for on-row data bound to this component. I had to fire an extra query. It was the only way I could do it, just because of the way our data source was set up by another developer who had since moved on from the project, and we were not allowed to change it. So given that, I wasn't able to change the stored procedure, if you will, to have the calculated value thrown in. Long story short, I just nailed performance against the wall. It only took an extra half second to load. I wasn't happy about this at all as a developer. I knew that this was not a scalable situation, but I left it alone. And so we pushed it out and it was sort of solved, but they said it was still slow. And I remember going on to a remote desktop session with them and I said, show me how slow it is. And it took 5 seconds to load the page. Now I couldn't figure out what was going on. So I kicked up Fiddler and I looked at a bunch of other stuff and I saw that, oh my goodness, lo and behold, we were asking them to download 520K worth of script files, image files, HTML, CSS, all the things that were needed for all the components on the main page. We had a bunch. We just kind of willy-nilly threw the components on there. It turned out that we probably weren't doing things very well. But in addition, we had no idea how to fix this problem, short of removing it entirely. So I remember I sat down with a CSS book, I sat down with HTML, I thought, I gotta figure this out. I'll nail this thing, and I did. I got the HTML down. I mean, I'd known HTML, but it had eroded out of my brain because I've been doing so many web forms things. And I got the size down exponentially of the page. Not only that, but since I moved to HTML, all of a sudden rollups were cake. They were just no problem at all. I was able to do a for loop on the page. And the best part about this whole story is I solved the problem easily, removed the grid component, and was ridiculed endlessly by the so-called master .NET developers that were there. I mean, we're all kind of were at the same level, but these guys are like, geez Louise, are you kidding me with this inline scripting? That right there, that example sort of in a little bottle crystallizes exactly what I'm trying to get across right here, right now. The abstraction is fine if you work inside of the designer and you're content working inside of the abstraction. But working with this abstraction comes at a price. And the price is that you're not allowed to work with the tools that go in to what makes the web run. For instance, HTML5 is coming around the corner with tons of new capabilities. Does this mean a whole new set of components that you have to work through, or can you just work through HTML5? JavaScript, jQuery came along and enabled so many different scenarios, but .NET developers were the last ones to pick up on it because we couldn't use it very well. The reason why is because our ID tags were mangled, and we got around it. But if you look at this from a holistic perspective, this turn towards MVC, it is because of standards. It is because of the rise of semantic markup, the rise of things like jQuery, the rise of the need to make sure that your pages are cross-browser compliant, that have pushed Microsoft to create a framework that is much more web-friendly, web developer-friendly. That's what MVC is all about. So here it is for you. This is your decision point. I'm not going to tell you need to do it to be a good developer. I would never say that. I'm sure you're going to be just a fine developer. What I'm saying is there's opportunities out here for you as a web developer to really nail what you're doing in the future.
Let's pick up from our scaffolding demo and move forward and show a continuation of work with ASP.NET MVC. And then I'm going to contrast it with that of web forms. Okay, well, here is our initial scaffolding attempt, scaffolding our post table in our blog database. And you can see we have the editor created for us. And now what I want to do is I want to work on some SEO. I want to make sure that this page is titled correctly so that search engines know what to do with it. So up here, I'm just simply going to work with the template. It already has a content space for the title, and here you can see, boom, out it comes. Now this next thing I want to do is, of course, I want to make sure I have H1s wrapped around the titles of my post so that search engines understand what it is they're playing with here. Always a good move when you're trying to help out the search engines. I also want to wrap things with divs, and there it is. You can see the content, see the way it looks. I have the HTML the way I want. And that kind of sped me along and pushed me in the right direction. Started solving business issues straight away. Now let's do the same thing with ASP.NET Web Forms. I'm going to try and work with the concept of scaffolding. There is no built-in attempt to do stuff like that in a RESTful approach, which is okay, because back when ASP.NET was created, there wasn't that kind of thing. All right, well, just to illustrate, I'm working with an ASP.NET web application. I'm using Link to SQL and my exact same blog database. So to get started, I'm going to add a new page in here and just go to Web and select New Web Form. First major difference between MVC and ASP.NET. ASP.NET, you work with resources on disk. With ASP.NET MVC, you actually return HTML as a result of a method. It's RPC, if you will. Okay, so a very typical workflow with web forms is to use the designer. Now, a lot of folks may not use this out of habits or in their normal routine. However, this is the typical way that it is meant to be used, and I'm trying to do the fastest thing possible in fairness. So I've created a data list here, and I've hooked it up to a link data source. I could have used a grid view, I totally know that. Except with a grid view, it's a little bit harder to customize the things you want. In this case, I just simply want a set of H1s that link off to another page. So I have an item template, and I can work with that in this way. So let's take a look at what this looks like. And as you can see, I've got page, got no title yet, that's okay. I also have a form, which is a little bit perplexing. I have an input and I have a table. So right off, I'm not getting back what I asked for. I didn't ask for a form, I didn't ask for an input. That's okay. That is something that is needed to kind of facilitate the abstraction of HTML, if you will. All right, well, let's do a little more work in here. I want to style this. I want it to look better. So I have a choice. I can work with the framework, and I can come in here and I can take a look at the auto format, which actually has alternating stuff, and well, it's pretty good so far. So if I'm in a hurry, this is the easiest possible thing I can do. The framework is doing things for me. It's making the UI and presentation look swell, but it's generating a lot of strange markup in the form of declarative coding. But let's handle the title right now, and we can deal with the other stuff later. So if I hit run and take a look at the code that it gives me, yes, it looks just swell. Here we are. We have a nice alternating list, and that's good. If we view the page source, once again, I have some strange stuff in here. I have IDs on my tables and spans, and not quite sure what that HTML is all about, and nor do I understand why I have a form. But I do understand that it's required by the framework. It's not required by HTML at all. It's just required by the framework to handle this stateful approach, even though I'm not doing any kind of form submissions. I'm not doing any kind of postback. Yes, I can disable postback, but again, that is massaging and working with the framework to get out of my way. Okay, well, let's do something here. We want to make sure that we can work closer with the HTML, and I can't really do much more with my data list here. So what I'm going to do is switch this over to a repeater. Repeaters are kind of the bare bones, for loops, if you will, of declarative markup. And what I'm going to do inside here is I am simply going to work with direct HTML in the item template. So inside the item template, let's do the eval function. I'm going to pull out my title and wrap it with a couple of H1s because I want to pay attention to my markup. Again, the reason why I want to pay attention to it is because search engines like structured markup. The better structured your stuff is, the more semantic, the more meaning you give it, the more search engines like you. All right, well, here we got H1s around our titles on our posts, and that's groovy. We're excited about that. Let's structure this a little bit more. I want to add in some links here, so I'm not going to use an anchor tag. Instead, I need to be using the ASP hyperlink control. And inside here, I want to make sure that I'm going to send this off to my details page and my edit page. And let's take a look at the way this looks. Great, getting there. Looks like I forgot the run at server tag, but that's okay. So I know for a lot of people, they are looking at this saying that's not quite a fair representation of what you can do with web forms, and that's true. The thing I was trying to show is the speediest result. With MVC, the speediest result working with the framework is you get a nice template that's easy to tweak in terms of HTML, SEO, and so on. When you're working with web forms, the easiest thing to do is to work with the framework, forget about the HTML, and you end up with a bunch of, stuff that looks like it was abstracted, like you didn't necessarily care about the HTML. What you cared about was the way it looked. What you're seeing right here is friction in action. So let's continue on and imagine we have a change in requirements. Imagine that, where the client wants to show a sum of all comments for our posts right underneath the display list. So with MVC, we can simply output a div with some meaningful ID here. Then we can wrap a sum of all the comments with a pair of H2 tags and maybe add a little emphasis to it. Why not? Make it look like we're important with all the comments we have. We hit run and take a look at our site, and there it is. Total comments. That's great. We can even add total comments per post. We can simply just output a value using our model right next to our title if we so chose. Okay, well, let's get back into our web forms example. And to do this with web forms, probably have to play nicely with the repeater that we've chosen here. And I'll put stuff in a footer template, then we kind of run into a problem. We've chosen to use the easiest way possible here. We're chosen to use the framework to our advantage, and unfortunately, we don't have a way of showing any kind of summary. Our data source is closed. Now, it is true that we can put some more code in the code behind. We can also tick an event, some sort of incrementer, with an on-item data bound. There's a lot of ways that we can solve this problem. However, it's going to require code, which is the whole point of this whole entire demonstration, that working with MVC sort of just pushes you along in, let's call it, the right direction, where you're working with the HTML and you're solving problems as transparently and frictionlessly as, if that's a word, as possible. With web forms, you've got to know the framework pretty well in order to understand the pitfalls that you might be falling into, and also how to work with a change in requirements without destroying your page.
Wow, that's a chicken. Actually, it's a rooster. Unfortunately, working with that abstraction has a price. Dude, shut up already. Unfortunately, that abstraction has a price. Go away!